Okay, so here's the thing. For $100, I bought this car that was sitting in the dirt for over 20 years, and after popping on some new tires, pushing it into my barn and doing a little bit of cleaning and general maintenance, my brother and I somehow managed to get the engine running. So, I rebuilt the brakes so I could take the car on its first drive in this millennium, and it was fantastically bad. There were some things not working, like the radiator fan and pop-up headlights, so I fixed those, and it was starting to really feel like a car and not a car-shaped lost cause. I wanted to do more than just a short drive around my neighborhood, but the gas tank I had was not repaired to my liking, even though I was very confident in it at first. So I spent my time cleaning this disgusting interior and making it look brand new while I was waiting on a new tank to come in. I then thought, what the hell? Let's do this project right. And I cleaned and resealed the entire engine and did a top-end rebuild all in the last episode. And now it's almost ready to come to life again. So let's put this hunk of junk back together and take this thing for a real drive that it so desperately deserves. Let's go. The last episode ended with the engine almost completely rebuilt and bolted back up to the subframe. Since that episode ended, I went ahead and did a lot more work getting it ready. The first thing that might stand out is the bright red polyurethane subframe bushings. I originally was going to keep the stock rubber bushings since they didn't look too bad, but I eventually came to my senses. On a car this old, it's best to replace pretty much any rubber that you can. I also installed the complete wiring harness along with all the sensors and ignition components. A new belt for the water pump and alternator was added, but not one for the AC compressor. I'll deal with all that stuff later. And I also did some little things like adding some thermal insulation to the starter motor since these are known to burn out fast due to the exhaust heat, and I painted up the air filter housing. I also cleaned up the gross, dirty engine bay, which was shown in a separate mini video in the Saturday Projects playlist. The only thing left now is the exhaust. The stock exhaust system is pretty much garbage. The catalytic converter is completely rotted through, as well as the not pictured muffler. The heat stove component that was used to bring hot air up to the intake to help get things warmed up faster, which was a leftover system designed for the early carbureted versions of this engine that wasn't yet removed on the early fuel injection versions, is going to be trashed as well. The only piece worth saving is the exhaust manifold. The two spring bolts that I had left soaking in some penetrating fluid were easily removed with the impact driver. And after giving it a nice blasting with the blasting cabinet, it actually didn't look too bad. But to make it look even better and protect it from rust, it was masked up and given a nice coat of Krylon's high heat paint. Nice. After it dried, I can bolt it up to the engine. Now for the rest of the exhaust system, I'll be using all new shiny components. This is a complete stock replacement kit specifically for the 4-cylinder Fiero that came from the Fiero store. The first thing I wanted to install was the muffler since it's the most annoying part to install. It has 6 little springs that hold the entire thing in place on the subframe, and they're a real pain. And after that was the head tube, which is the piece that connects the manifold to the new catalytic converter. And after doing a bit more fiddling with the rest of the pieces, I realized that everything is wrong. But it's too cold and I'm too tired to explain right now, so I'm gonna come back in the morning. So yeah, let me show you what's going on. When looking at the original exhaust compared to the new one, you can see that it's not quite the same. This straight section is a little long and needs to be cut down to meet up to the muffler correctly. But that is not only okay, it's to be expected. But what's neither of those things is that this section is almost 4 inches too long, with almost no room for adjustment. Why? With it so long, it's causing the entire exhaust system to be in the wrong place, pushing the cat so far back that it would be hitting the firewall. Now, you could very easily cut one of the straight sections of the cat and shorten it, which would work, if that was the only issue. The flange section up at the top of the head tube, which is supposed to push against the flare, is sitting way too high. So much so that it's practically touching the manifold when it's absolutely not supposed to. What gives the clamping force on this section is the springs pushing the flare and the whole pipe up against the graphite gasket in the manifold. But with the flange so far up, the springs aren't compressed as much as they should be, causing there to be way less force exerted on the flange. The stock system has the flange way lower, compressing the springs more, creating more force. The fit between the pipe and the flange isn't meant to be super tight, so maybe it's not too bad if it's not clamping as well as it could be. However, it would be wobbling around so much due to the fact that the new pipe doesn't have the bracket that the isolator springs clip onto in order to hold everything in place, like the original one has. This kinda sucks, with the tube having so many issues, including the fit into the cat being so poor. It's just way too loose and should be at least a little bit snug. The best option is going to be just using the original head tube and welding it to the new cat. So let's do that. Yeah, I don't like that at all. Now the welds aren't the best, I got a lot of room for improvement, I know, but at least there's no gaps and it'll be airtight. Oh fudge knuckles. Wow, I need to learn to cut straight. Not to worry, I've got this. Nice. Ugly as all heck, but it's together and there's going to be no leaks. I know that for a fact because, well, this is narration, and seeing as how linear time works, I've already experienced it not leaking. Also, hey, don't worry, these aren't supposed to be parallel. I tried to match the angle of the original one as best as I could. And after a quick sanding and mineral spirit cleaning, I gave this thing a coat of more high heat paint to protect the bare metal. And after it was dry, it's now time for the final install of the exhaust. Besides the exhaust tip, that's everything. That was the last thing preventing me from wanting to bolt this drivetrain back up to the car. And since there's literally only 4 bolts that hold the entire thing up, let's do this. Right now. It's not a fun process, especially by yourself, constantly having to hop back and forth making sure everything is lining up and adjusting if you need to, but honestly, it went pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things. Wow, it's really in here, isn't it? You know, when I started this project almost 2 years ago, I never imagined that I would have done as much as I have. I was only going to rebuild the brakes, replace the water pump, clutch, and whatever little sensors needed it. Basically, the absolute minimal amount of work to get this thing going. But if it weren't for you guys caring so much about this car of mine and my journey, I don't think I ever would have made it this far. So thank you. Thank you for that. There are still a few more little things to take care of. Hoses, cables, plugs, all the fun stuff. But I was eager to get this thing going, so I didn't bother with the unnecessary stuff for running the engine, like the transmission cables, slave cylinder or AC lines. I only installed just what it needed to test how it runs. So after filling it up with some fresh oil, it was almost ready to turn over. The last thing to do was fill the transmission with oil. Now with it in neutral, the output shafts aren't going to be connected to the engine as if it were in gear, but everything inside is still spinning the whole time, so it needs fluid for sure before it started up. But there's currently only paper towels plugging the output holes, and the oil would just flow right out. So it's time to put the drive axles back in. But no, not like this. Like this. And with the seals oiled up, I can slide in the shafts. You have to make sure they click into place though. And with both sides in, I can now add the oil. And I'll be using Synchro Mesh. The transmission originally had 5W30, but GM later made a service announcement to switch over to this stuff. There's a plug on top where you can fill it from, but I was having the darndest time getting it off, so I just filled it from the speed sensor hole after I took that out. It's also what you use to measure how much fluid is in here, so I guess it was coming off anyway. Okay, so there is no gas in the car, because there's no gas tank in the car, and also the coolant is also empty. But oil is added to both the engine and transmission, and so at this point I'm going to turn the engine over just to prime the oil system so everything is lubricated inside before it actually fires for the first time. Alright, we got oil pressure. It's about 50. I'm going to do that again, then I just need to install a gas tank and it should fire right up. The custom fuel sender unit I made back in part 5 can now be installed in the used tank that Alex from Lightspeed Fiero sent me. And now all of that back in the car. And the last thing there is some gas. Okay, here it goes. Why isn't it firing? After a few more failed attempts and standing around in various positions thinking, I decided to call it a night and come back in the morning. Okay, so there's fuel being delivered just fine. The valves are opening and closing, from what I can see, just fine. The timing can't be wrong. I put the distributor in the correct position and the computer does all the micro adjustments for how advanced it is. I mean, I obviously didn't do something like put the spark plug wires in the reverse order, because that would be embarrassing. Wowie, that sounds like hot garbage. Something obviously isn't right. The smoke is normal after a fresh rebuild, especially since I dumped a lot of fuel in there last night that didn't get burnt off. But before running the engine anymore, I decided to go ahead and add some coolant. But in the midst of adding some, and by midst I mean immediately,
that's not good.
I noticed there was a leak. Right at the thermostat housing, which honestly is a pretty fortunate place to have a leak. So it looks like the paper gasket that came with the rebuild kit didn't quite do the trick for making a good seal. That also might be due to the fact that the mating surface is not totally flat. So after a little persuasion, I got it looking better. This time I used RTV, which is how it was from the factory. And after 24 hours to let that fully dry, more coolant was added, this time with no leaks. So the idle was either extremely high or almost dying. There's no vacuum leaks or anything, I checked, and also whenever I gave it throttle and released it, it wants to almost die right away. So what in the hoo-ha is happening? After a little bit of research and talking to people, I ordered some parts that might be the solution. So while waiting for those to come in, I think it's about time to do something about the suspension and get this car back on the ground on all four wheels. With the cradle back in the car, this is the only thing that needs to be taken care of before we can lower it down on all four wheels again. Every single thing here, minus a few lug nuts, is probably factory original. The bushings are worn to heck and the struts are shot, not to mention everything just being overall dirty and rusty. Pretty much everything came off relatively easy, but in order to remove the axle nut without just spinning the entire CV shaft around, you have to lock the studs with something like a crowbar. And also, if it wasn't clear yet, I actually did this dismantling before the engine went in. That way I could have the CV axles ready to plug up the transmission. And that's everything. The dust shields are a little bit scabby, but now they look better. And with a coat of paint, even better than before. The knuckles don't look too bad, but the rust definitely needs addressing. Now, as much as I love sandblasting, I also really hate sandblasting. It's not too fun being hunched over that machine for hours on end. So for these, I'm gonna try something different. Electrolysis, removing rust with the power of electricity. It's not the quickest method of rust removal, but it allows for the work to be done passively so I can take care of other things while these knuckles are getting cleaner by themselves. And after a while, it did a hell of a job. Not bad at all. With there still being some light surface rust, a lot of it because of flash rusting, I went ahead and sprayed it down with Eastwood's Rust Encapsulator. The entire process was repeated for the other knuckle as well. But going back in time when these were still in the electrolysis bath, I was taking care of the lower control arms. Old bushings and old ball joints. The service manual calls for replacing the entire control arm instead of just the ball joint alone, and that's because GM, in their infinite wisdom, decided to rivet the ball joints to the control arm. And you can't just buy these at a Pontiac dealership anymore, for multiple reasons, so these rivets have to go. With a grinder, I was able to cut off one from the top and one from the bottom, but I couldn't really get to the third one without cutting into the wall of the control arm, so I used the chisel bits on an air hammer to basically just destroy it. This tool was coming out anyways, since these are so rusted in they have to be punched out. This little bracket that sits on top got pretty mangled when I was removing it, but with a little bit of heat and hammering, it's back to being straight. But nice! With that guy out, it's time for the bushings. To remove them, I'm going to be using a ball joint and bushing press. It's basically just a big C-clamp with different size collars and presses. The clamping force pushes the bushing out of the control arm as long as there's a collar with a larger diameter than the bushing on the other side, allowing it to move. And let me just tell you that this sucks. A lot. A lot actually. It might be fine on newer or less rusty components, but this was awful. The bushing was so frozen in there that it was actually just squeezing in the two walls of the control arm. Granted, this is stamped steel, so it's not as strong as something that would be fully boxed in, but it still shouldn't be this bad. It seems to be sliding on one side, but stuck to the other, which is why it's bending in on itself. So maybe a little hammering might help? Damn it. Oh, that f***ing worked. Holy sh**. Look at that. Well, alright. Let's try that again on the other side. Same case as before. Damn. That'll do it. So with these bushings finally gone, control arm sandblasted, and everything repeated for the other side, it's time to paint these. After giving them a nice scuffing and wiped down with mineral spirits, I thought I would do something a little different this time. For everything I painted previously on this project, I didn't use primer, which is more than likely fine, but it definitely helps. So this time I got some primer designed for adhesion to metal where you can top coat it immediately without having to wait for it to dry and sand it. Now, I don't know if it was because it was cold, or if it wasn't compatible with the 2K top coat that I used, or maybe just because this product is absolute garbage, but I had a bad time with this. It came out way too thick and never seemed to fully dry, even after a week had passed. I was able to press my finger hard onto it and it would still wrinkle. Now, I know that primer is the right thing to do, but maybe not this kind. But hey, at least it still looks pretty nice. The last suspension component is the rear shock assemblies. Now 90% of my assembly is garbage, and all that I'll be saving is the spring, rubber spring cushions, strut bellow, and the upper spring perch. And a spring compressor has to be used here, since otherwise as soon as you got the retainer nut off, everything would fly apart. This spring is expelling a lot of force, and you gotta do something about that. I'm also wearing a full face shield, just in case. Now this retainer nut was really on there. I resorted to the impact driver, but it probably wasn't wise to use 2 chrome step-down adapters with a 1/4 inch socket because I pretty much right away jammed the socket on there way too tight and snapped the adapter inside the socket. Now, it's stuck on there. Believe it or not, this was actually an extra 10mm socket that I had lying around, so I was comfortable just welding it off. And actually, I can just weld it permanently to be a big tool. Now obviously I didn't need to use this as a tool, let alone weld the socket off at all, but it was a lot nicer to hold this tube as a handle rather than a wrench or a ratchet. The spring was a little old looking, but still in good condition overall. I started blasting it, but it was taking a very long time, and I realized that I don't need to remove all the paint, I just have to ensure that there's good adhesion. So with a little bit of scuffing and wiping down with mineral spirits, I got to spraying. And unfortunately, this was actually before I sprayed the control arms and didn't yet know how bad the primer was, so that went on first. And after a few nice coats of black enamel, it looked great. And after repeating all the same steps on the other spring, it was time to put everything back together. There's new bushings for the control arms and the shock absorbers, as well as new shock absorbers, ball joints, bearings, and a bunch of other hardware not shown. And everything else is just the original stuff cleaned up. The first thing back together are the knuckles. The new axle seal is driven in from the outside but pushed all the way to the end of the inside edge of the bore. A big PVC pipe coupler was the perfect size for this. Some high temperature grease was put all around the seal and inside the bore, as well as around the new bearing. And then a new O-ring is slid in place and more grease is applied around that. And after sliding the dust shield on, I could go ahead and bolt it all down. And it won't be until everything is installed on the car that I'll torque it all to spec. And after doing the other side as well, that's both knuckles ready to be installed. Now driving in the bushings is pretty much the exact same process as removing them. You crank down the clamp, hammer the lip a little bit to push back the stamped metal after it was squeezed in, and repeat, and repeat. And once those are fully seated, I could work on the new ball joint. And instead of rivets, these come with new hardware. The nuts for here are a special kind of lock nut that is pressed in on the top, so it's more of an ovular shape to make a really tight fit, so it won't back out. A new Zerk fitting for grease was then threaded on and tightened down. Now that would be the last attention for these guys, but there was some paint rubbed off during the bushing install process, but that can easily be touched up with some black enamel paint. This kinda stinks not being perfect, but ultimately it'll never be seen, so as long as it's safe from rust, that's all that really matters. So after that are the shocks. The new strut has an Allen head, whereas the original was a regular hex, but it all goes on the same way. The strut attachment to the knuckle is what controls the camber of the rear wheels. Looking at the ring left by the washer on the original struts, I can do a best guess of what it should be on the new one. The adjustment here is so minute that it really doesn't matter too much right now, since I'll be getting a proper alignment when everything is finished. But with these bolted up, the rear suspension is ready to go back on the car. The lower control arm was going on first, and to get the CV axle out of the way, I held it up with some wire. The control arm was then pushed into place, and I very loosely threaded on the nuts to the bolts that passed through the bushings. After greasing up the spines of the axle was installing the shock assembly. I struggled a little bit holding it up there, but I eventually got a nut around one of the studs in order to hold it up, while I threaded in the rest. The axle was slid into the hub, and then the new washer and axle nut was threaded on. Since this is also one of those ovular lock nuts that make turning it by hand pretty much impossible, the impact driver was used to quickly seat it down. And I realized I forgot to install the shock absorber washer plates, so the nuts were removed one at a time and reinstalled with the plate in place. Along with them was also the vent panel bracket. I was having a little trouble getting the ball joint into the knuckle, and I eventually just ended up loosening the shock bolts to tilt it in more, making lining it up with the shaft easier. And after clamping that down, I tightened back up the shock bolts. Now that's the last suspension component installed. Kind of. There's one more thing missing, and that's the tie rod. Now 99.99% of the time, tie rods are part of the steering system and are what pulls the wheels left and right when you turn the steering wheel and in turn the steering rack. As I said in part 1 of this series over a year ago, the rear suspension of the early model Fieros is from the front of the Chevrolet Citation and Pontiac Phoenix. It's just put in the back. So since the wheels need to stay straight and there's no steering rack like there originally was designed to be, GM just made it so that the tie rods bolt directly to the subframe. Pretty smart. And I should say that GM likes to call this piece a toe link bar, even if that's not what it originally was. The inner ball joint is a Fiero specific part and is pretty pricey. Mine is still in good condition, albeit a little dirty, so I cleaned it up and rotated it around a bunch, trying my best to get it greased up. It's supposed to rotate smoothly, yet firmly. If it's really loose, that's when you have a problem. And earlier I marked out the location of the center of the old tie rod, so that way I can get another best guess for alignment when installing the new one. And after that's bolted up, both on the subframe and at the knuckle, I can torque everything to spec. The very last thing to do for the suspension is grease up those ball joints. Alrighty, on 4 wheels again. Let's see if I can do something about getting it running properly. So I was able to move the car to my driveway as another project took over the barn as its new home for the time being. In the spirit of being safe and not trusting old components, I went ahead and purchased a new idle air control valve and a new map sensor. The idle air control valve had to be cleaned in part 2 in order to work properly when we got the car running, so it was probably due for a replacement soon. The map sensor was still operating just fine, but it's so cheap that it should just be replaced anyways. The injector is the one that came from the car from the factory, and it's had its fair share of abuse and time being unkind to it. If you remember, it was completely clogged also back in part 2, and we had to clean it out for it to work. So instead of trying that again, I didn't want to take any chance of it being faulty in the future. I bought a brand new one. Now, hopefully, it should fire right up. Except that it doesn't. There's fuel coming out, and I know the map sensor is unplugged, but that shouldn't make it not start, just not run properly. What's happening is that there's no spark. Classic. I wasn't getting any spark at the plugs, and I figured that it was probably the fault of the ignition control module. I went ahead and purchased a new one, a new distributor cap, and a new rotor. I also bought new copper spark plugs. Since the ones I originally bought were iridium, I read online that these cars prefer the copper ones. But I ripped one of the plug wire ends when trying to pull it off, and it was too late to go buy a new one at this time, so I had to wait until morning. Okay. Let's see if it starts now. Holy belt squeal, Batman. I need to tension that alternator a little bit more. Okay, it's still not running right. It's bogging down way too much, and whenever I give it the gas, it stalls immediately. It was around this time that I heard a crinkling metal noise. There's way too much negative pressure in here. That pop is the gas tank expanding back into shape. That's not good. That means it's not venting properly. I got the air hose and blew it back into the tank, and you can see the fumes coming out fine here, so it seems like the line coming from the tank is okay, but the line coming from the charcoal canister to the engine, however, okay, yeah, that was definitely clogged. And that fixed the venting issue. I haven't heard a single crinkle since then. But did it fix how it's running? Absolutely not. It was at this point that I checked the throttle position sensor, and wouldn't you know it, it was bent in such a fashion that the computer would be receiving a signal saying it was in a more closed position than it physically was in, meaning that the computer thinks it needs to squirt out less fuel. And after making it straight, did it fix it? What do you think? There was still something else wrong. The spray pattern should not look like this. There's some full-on drops in there, not the spray or mist that it's supposed to be. It was at this point that I took off the fuel filter and so much rust and debris poured out. I didn't film that happening, but this is what's left over from that. This means I have to drop the tank again. It turned out that the tank that Alex from Lightspeed Fiero sent me in part 5 was not quite as clean as either of us thought. And I was so done with gas tanks at this point that I never wanted to touch one again. So instead of trying to clean this one and potentially having issues still in the future, I wanted to just pay whatever money it would cost to buy one that would give me no issue whatsoever. The seller of this tank told me that it would have some surface rust, which is acceptable, but they wouldn't send me anything that was rotted through. I gave it a vinegar bath to take care of what there was, and pinholes. Gas tanks. I was about to just bite the bullet and pay $350 to have this professionally cleaned, repaired, and coated internally, when an angel shined down upon me. Angel Fiero on Instagram, that is. Jason had a tank that was perfect, rust-free, and only $75.
Oh my gosh, he's a freaking saint. Oh, Jason, I love you.
I installed a new fuel pump and strainer onto the fuel sending unit. I didn't want to risk having debris clogged in the pump that was in Alex's tank. But before installing it, I blasted the fuel lines with compressed air to make sure there's nothing clogging them. I definitely don't want to touch any fuel-related components ever again. Okay, so, rebuilt engine, new clutch master and slave, new ignition components, and new fuel system. Will this finally be roadworthy?
Ready?
Yeah.
1 year and 9 months ago, I got this car. And now it's finally road legal. It's not a project that might work or something that might break down. It's finally just a car. And it came from sitting in the dirt for over 20 years to where it is now because of me, and my brother, and my friends, and all of you guys. But don't give yourself too much credit, it's still a piece of junk. The front suspension is all original and very rusty and worn. There's panels that are drooping, split, cracked, missing, and broken. It needs a lot more work before the journey is over. 3 more episodes of work to be precise. Maybe a few more of the smaller videos like I did for the intake assembly, subframe, and engine bay. But 3 more full episodes for sure. So, until next time, I'll see you guys later.